Hello and welcome back to the London Leadership Academy's series of 7 short modules for primary care network colleagues. My name's Louisa Hardman and it's great to have you with me today for the 4th of our series of 7 short hour-long modules, which I very much hope you'll be able to watch at your own pace, stopping and starting them whenever you've got a moment. To locate what we're doing today then, on the 23rd of May, we're looking at managing through resistance. And rather than treat this topic in isolation, it's really helpful to think of it as building on everything we've spoken about so far. Resistance is very related to your personal presence and impact. It's also critical to think about how you might influence for change as a way of reducing resistance, something I'll come back to later. Giving and receiving feedback itself can produce our resistance to giving and also our resistance to receiving. So everything we've done so far is very pertinent. I'll be referring specifically to influencing for change, but it's really well worthwhile if you're focused on managing through resistance and feel that you have particular challenges around that, to look back on the previous modules, because there may be some sources of inspiration or information in the previous modules. And let's also recognise that leading through resistance is very likely to be relevant at the moment, given that we're at another period of significant change in the NHS. And I'm not there only thinking about the move to integrated care, but also, of course, the challenges to workforce and the changes to service provision that implies and requires. So I do hope that this is going to be a particularly pertinent module for you. A couple of thoughts then. Firstly, we know that only 30% of change efforts succeed. Question is why? And in fact, since 1948, the inception of the NHS, the service has been through, the Nuffield Trust suggests, at least 42 changes, really significant changes. And one of the things that we probably all recognise is that change is a constant in the NHS. And of course, that in itself may well be a reason that colleagues, including ourselves, are change resistant. Maybe we're change weary. Maybe there's also something about true change never really being embedded. And so we're in a constant cycle of innovating and leading new change as opposed to consolidating established change. But one of the perspectives on why change efforts don't succeed is the existence of resistance. Resistance is very likely. What do we mean by the term resistance? That in itself is a very important thing to be thinking about. Dictionary definitions include, for example, the refusal to accept or comply with something. Also include being opposed to and wanting to prevent something. Now, of course, let's just pause here, because the language suggests that we're likely as change leaders to see resistance as being challenging, as being conflictual, potentially also even as being hostile. So we might be braced to handle resistance. But let's actually look at this from a different perspective. So we are actually inclined to understand the experience of resistance and even the word resistance through the lens, even the bias, as it says on this slide, of those introducing change, and then to see it as blocking or unhelpful, as I've already described. So the language of obstaculizers to refer to those who are in opposition, frequently being used. But actually, as Cotter and Schlesinger say, one other way of thinking about this is empathically looking at it through the lens of those who we experience as resisting. What's going on for them? It may well be that it's their attempt to regulate events in a healthy way, to be protective. The disagreement with the change as being the wrong thing to do for good and right reason is a very real possibility. And therefore, the truth of this is that resistance is often used as a label by people in positions of power about the reactions of people with less power. Now that's really helpful to be thinking about, because it might change our stance on and our attitude to resistance, and that's helpful in a way that I'll describe later. But for now, I'm going to ask you to bring this to life in your own experience and from your own experience by thinking about when you yourself have been resistant to change that's being introduced. So please identify at the time. We will all have been resistant. And so if you can find an example in your own history, maybe at the moment, where you have felt resistant to change, it'd be helpful for you to be thinking about what form your resistance took. Do you withdraw? Do you become non-participant? Do you become very critical? Do you actually focus on the individual rather than the argument? So what form does your resistance typically take if it has a pattern? And what were you resistant for? What was your response that others might label resistant in support of? And what did reduce your resistance, if anything? Or if nothing did, then what could have? What response might have reduced your experience of and behaviour of resistance? You, of course, probably wouldn't describe yourself as resistant. That's the point here, isn't it? I'd like to ask you to think about yourself from the perspective of the individual or individuals who are trying to introduce some change. So this might be a good time to pause the video and just do some reflection on these questions and then come back in. So presuming you've given that some thought, let's move the conversation on. So resistance is a very helpful reminder of what we need. This is an unusually brief equation that describes what needs to happen that have to be cumulatively greater to the existing resistance in order to move beyond resistance to create change. So the R stands for resistance, and the following three perspectives need to be present and to be cumulatively greater than the energy for resistance. So the D stands for dissatisfaction. So in order to overcome resistance, we need to make sure that individuals are unsatisfied with the way that circumstances are at play at the moment. So there needs to be enough dissatisfaction to mobilise for change. Plus, the V stands for vision. There needs to be a clear and imaginable plan that will create a new outcome, a change perspective, a change possibility. And the P stands for that plan. So, firstly, to be very precise, do you have enough dissatisfaction around the issue that you're seeking to change? Do you have a vision for how that will be improved? Do you have a plan? Without those three, say the writers Beckard and Thomas, you won't be able to move beyond resistance. So very practical, very useful perspective there. Now, of course, another point that comes from our previous module on influencing for change is that probably the best approach to managing for resistance and through resistance is to minimize the existence of it. We might never be able to completely move through change without any resistance at all, and I'll describe why that might be true, but it's quite likely that our approach to change leadership can significantly reduce the amount of resistance that we find ourselves needing to manage. And in fact, many people say that it's not the content of change to which they're resistant, it's more the way in which the change is led. So influencing for change, the previous module, I would really encourage you to have a look at, because it talks a lot about how you might engage early rather than have resistance to deal with later. Beyond that, as I'm saying here, what we might do is know how to best approach resistance by looking at two things, by understanding that it's inevitable. and that it's not necessarily oppositional. That's really very important. You may yourself have noticed when you were resistant, it may not necessarily have been that you were hostile to or seeking to challenge the change or the individual change leader. It may well have been that what lay behind your resistance was discomfort or overwhelm or uncertainty. It could have been disagreement. Maybe you didn't have the skills necessary to take on what it was, or the capacity to take on what was being suggested, all of which needs to be understood in order that we get underneath this label resistance, which we might feel defensive about and braced to oppose ourselves, and bring a more empathic way of working. And of course, what's key to what I'm saying there is that a defensive approach in us is probably the single most difficult response to resistance, because it actually then creates a cycle of our opposition and defensiveness to another person's opposition and defensiveness. So I want to suggest that we take a radical stance now and think empathically about what lies behind resistance, rather than just settle on understanding how to manage something we call resistance. We use the label. First thing in that is to knowing what form of, what appearance of resistance will most unsettle you. Because understanding how to manage ourselves through feeling unsettled is one of the best ways of minimizing our own resistance and our own defense. So what kind of appearances, what forms are there of resistance? You might encounter dismissal. This is nothing new. We've been here before. It'll never work. This is rubbish. They always get it wrong. A real hostility to what it is that you're wanting to introduce. Blame. If only they or you had done what was expected, but they never help us. Nothing will ever change. A real sense of victimhood, a real sense of attack. And of course, what we know is that resistance isn't always that apparent. Very often resistance might be more disguised. It might, as I was suggesting, look like silence. There may well be lots of what we describe as corridor politics, or the rumour mill, agreement on the surface, but nothing happening in practice. So there are very ostentatious forms of resistance, but there are also quite subtle forms of resistance. Now, what I'd like to ask you now is to pause and think, which form of resistance is likely to most derail you? And to focus in on that particularly, to bringing empathy and understanding and compassion to the other people that you're dealing with. Because if they're expressing those forms of resistance, then there may well be a really rich conversation to be had about what it is that underlies that form of resistance. One way of thinking of this also is that potentially resistance is part of acceptance. Now, this might seem quite a challenging notion, but also quite a useful notion. It's true that people take time to adjust to what might be experienced as a difficult message, or at least some change. And it's also likely that you will have taken your own time to get to a point of acceptance on the change that you're needing to lead. So you'll be at the end of this change curve, whereas other people, when you're at the point of introducing the change to them, will just be at the start of this trajectory. So let's have a look at some of the emotions here, because some of these emotions aren't about feeling good, but they do change over time. So once you're describing the change plan, there may be shock, there may be denial. That then moves to the potential for blame or anger, and then self-blame or confusion, before there's the potential for acceptance or development or growth. The interesting root of this is the notion that change has two dimensions to it. The first dimension is the material or the objective, the thing itself that is changing. But this graph is about transition. It's the emotion behind the change. And that often lags behind the material or concrete change. The essence of this is a quote from a woman called Jill Bolt Taylor, which is, although many of us may think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, biologically, we are feeling creatures that think. And so our feelings need to catch up with our thoughts. And that's what's happening in this change curve. So that would mean you need to work with people's emotion. And in order to work with people's emotion, I want to make sure that you understand that resistance, therefore, isn't to be seen as unexpected, and it's not necessarily a sign of disloyalty. It doesn't mean that what you're doing won't work, can't work, or isn't working. And it certainly needs to be not taken personally. The reaction that you're getting isn't to undermine you, it's a response to the change that you're needing to lead. And that might free things up so that you can deal with the resistance impersonally, i.e., not to think of it as being a criticism of you, but a criticism or a critique or a response to the change, which then resources you to deal with the emotion. And if we come back to the change curve now, how might you deal with the emotion? This is probably a screen to take a screenshot of. So if we see shock, we might empathise. If we see denial, we might make sure that there is real understanding of the sincerity of the change message, but also a beginning of you demonstrating that that change is definitely going to happen. Here's the key thing about feeling blame: not to take it personally. In the face of anger, to listen, to be curious. It's very difficult to be defensive when we're curious. To empathise with individuals who feel that they've brought this on themselves. To listen and empathise again with any confusion. This point here is the moment of acceptance, or surrender, as some writers call it, where we realise that the change that we might have been denying or railing against is actually going to happen. And we turn our sights to thinking how we can actually integrate that into our lives. So we might encourage that movement, to offer developmental support and to offer affirmation and appreciation. So a really different perspective here, to look behind the language of one single word, resistance, and to understand the emotion that might lie behind it, and to deal with that emotion and address that emotion with empathy, but also to recognize that resistance is most likely to happen on this part of the change transition here. And if we think of it like that, the existence of resistance might even encourage us to recognize that the change is being assimilated and it is actually being internalized, and that your change message potentially there is actually working. But if we look even deeper at the causes of resistance, which I hope amplify this approach to empathy around resistance, at the individual level, fear of the unknown, self-interest, habit, needing to change something that I'm expert in, needing to think again, not wanting to attend to things that aren't in my immediate vicinity, feeling insecure about what the change means for me and whether or not I'll be able to accommodate the new approach in my way of working. It also might be a legitimate business concern. And of course, from that perspective, it's very important not just to entertain and to empathize with resistance, but to ask ourselves a really profound question, which is this: how might they be right? Really important to recognize that resistance often is a voice that we're unwilling to listen to, but actually might be even constructive to strengthen our change. At the group level, resistance will be similar, but threats to power and influence of interest groups and individuals or coalitions who are particularly powerful in the system. So the integrated care system at the moment of course, challenges the power of the acute trusts. And just last week, there was a letter suggesting that in Health Services Journal, lack of trust, different goals, resource limitations. All of these different perspectives give us that critical empathy and insight into what we might be dealing with, which leads to two potential perspectives which amplify what we said already. We need to empathise rather than defend to work with resistance. 3 quotes here for you. All resistance is a mobilisation of energy, not a lack of energy. The question then is, how can you channel that energy into change rather than opposition? Resistance is not just a dumb barrier to be removed, but a creative force for managing a difficult world. So the underlying question, how are your colleagues right where they're appearing resistant, is important here. And those with less power cannot easily say no, so they fall back on reactions which are then labelled as resistance. So you can be helpful in the face of resistance, trying to understand, trying to explore, trying to establish what would need to be in place for colleagues to engage in a constructive and a fruitful way. And some practical techniques for you. The first is to name and explore resistance early, surface it early, to give some preliminary thought as you approach change to who's losing what and who's gaining what, because that'll give you a preliminary sense of where you might expect what you might think of resistance as coming from. Talk to individuals on an individual basis rather than a group basis and find out, explore, empathise at their concerns, acknowledge those concerns. Think what you can offer people that might be real constructive incorporation of their views. It might be symbolic acknowledgement or recognition of what it is that they're holding dear. Understanding who holds power, again, to inform your view and practice on who to engage with. Establishing forum for discussing views. I've worked with several trusts where, in going through major change, the senior management team have established a fortnightly or monthly forum, which is an open invitation for people to come together to talk about the change without any agenda. Emphasising the problem that is the reason for the change. Very, very frequently, we talk about what needs to change and how we're going to change it. We don't talk about what the challenge is that gives rise to the need for change in the first place. And if we can align people around a challenge, the problem, then it's much easier to align people around the solution. As we've already said, involving people early in problem-solving activity and in action planning. People always find it harder to resist their own good ideas. Making sure people have some sense of control by offering regular update meetings on what's happening with the change intention. Making sure that you make it real by communicating and publicising those short-term wins or the symbolic changes, the real practical differences that are steps along the way of the journey of change. And always review the impact of the change that you're leading to ensure that it is actually delivering its underlying intention. In that way, keeping people engaged not only in the progress of change, but also with the impact of change. So as ever, I very much hope that this short module has been helpful and comes at a time when it's going to be fruitful and useful for you. Next time we meet on the 9th of June from 4:15 to 5:15, we'll be looking at a very related issue, the challenge of difficult conversations, a very practical session which I'll offer many tools and techniques that you'll be able to make real and immediate use of. So thank you for your attention in this short module. I do hope it's been worthwhile and wish you well with the next steps you take on managing resistance.